One evening in February 2021, Captain Shane Ryan was returning to port in St. Augustine, Florida with his 8-person fishing party. The 54-foot sport fishing boat named About Time was near the inlet, cruising at about 21 knots, when suddenly the boat slammed to a halt. They had hit something.
We hit a object in the inlet here, and we are taking on water.
The rear of the vessel lifted out of the water, the engine stalled. Part of a propeller had pierced the hull. Captain Ryan was able to steer the ship into the shallows and beach it as they waited for help to arrive.
Coast Guard, we are on the beach. We are definitely on mud.
What they couldn't know then was that the About Time had struck a North Atlantic right whale calf and its mother. By the next morning, the calf had washed ashore, dead.
It had propeller wounds. The mother of that calf was found alive days later with similar wounds.
The mother, nicknamed Infinity, hasn't been seen since. The ship, a $1.2 million vessel, was a total loss. This story, and more like it, give reason to a new proposed rule that aims to reduce these kinds of vessel strikes and add protections to North Atlantic right whales. This is Dive In with NOAA Fisheries. I'm John Sheehan. Today, we'll hear about the proposed regulation, who it'll impact, and how it can help. The proposal is open now for public comment, and whether you are a boater, a coastal resident, or just someone interested in conservation, you should absolutely weigh in and help craft these regulations. You'll hear how a little later. To back up a second, let's remind ourselves a little about North Atlantic right whales.
The species is found in the Northwest Atlantic Ocean. Their range is generally from Florida to coastal Canada.
And most importantly,
North Atlantic right whales, unfortunately, are in very, very bad shape. Our best estimates indicate that there are fewer than 350 individuals left in the population and approaching extinction.
This is my guest, Dr. Caroline Good, a large whale ecologist and the lead on right whale vessel strike related issues. She works in NOAA Fisheries Office of Protected Resources.
The primary threats right now for right whales are human-related, and these include entanglement in fishing gear and vessel strikes.
Today, we're talking about the second of those human-related threats, vessel strikes.
All large whale species are susceptible to vessel strike, and they sustain generally two different types of injuries. One is blunt force trauma from coming into contact with a hull or propeller, and the second are laceration injuries, again, from coming into contact either with a sharp part of the hull or, again, usually the propeller.
These strikes and the high number of deaths they've caused in the US and Canada led NOAA scientists to declare a UME, or unusual mortality event.
Since 2017, the right whale UME includes 50 events, and these are 50 both mortalities and what we call serious injuries. An injury that is bad enough that the animal is more likely than not to die from that injury. And for such a small population, you can imagine, 50 events in a UME, that's a lot to have had since 2017.
Just a quick note here. Since I recorded this interview with Caroline, that number has already gone up.
In fact, the sole source of mortality for juveniles and adults that we have detected in right whales over the past 20 years is human-related, meaning that these juveniles and adults are never living long enough to actually ever be documented to die of natural causes.
Now, there's an existing rule that was meant to address these vessel strikes. It was established in 2008 and very broadly says that boats over 65 feet in length have to transit at 10 knots, or roughly 12 miles per hour, in certain areas and at certain times in zones up and down the East Coast. But here's the thing about that existing rule.
It is helping to a degree, but we're missing the mark. We're still continuing to have strikes. There is a misalignment between where these seasonal speed restriction areas are and where the risk is occurring along the U.S. coast.
Vessel strikes are happening outside of the current reduced speed zones. The whales are changing up their migration patterns and foraging for food in new and different places, at least partly due to climate change. And we know this thanks to all the research, observation, and data collection that's happened since 2008.
The second issue has to do with the vessels that are subject to speed restriction. Another thing that we have discovered is a problem with vessels under 65 feet striking and harming right whales. So since 2005, we have 8 vessel strike events involving vessels less than 65 feet. 6 involved lethal injuries, and these are all occurring within U.S. waters. And so it's very clear that this smaller vessel size class is a real problem. And I think that would surprise many people. I think most people think of a vessel killing a whale has to be larger than the whale, and that's not true. So the proposed regulations would also add vessels, most vessels within the 35 to 65 foot range.
The About Time, the boat I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, was 54 feet long and plenty capable of killing a whale.
The majority of vessels within that size class are recreational and pleasure boats, but there are also all sorts of other passenger boats and tour boats and work and industrial boats. So there's actually a fairly wide variety of vessel types that are in that size class. The largest vessels are almost always going to cause a lethal encounter with any animal, but the smaller a vessel gets, the more important a reduced speed may be in reducing the lethality of any kind of interaction. We believe that by slowing vessels, whales also may be able to better detect the vessel and avoid a collision themselves.
Do we know, between the new size limitations and the new seasonal zone recommendations, how many boaters are we talking about?
We're estimating that the proposed changes may affect just under 16,000 vessels. However, I should note that we cast a pretty wide net when trying to estimate particularly those vessels under 65 feet, how many of them may be impacted. So we acted conservatively and pulled in vessels that may not actually regularly transit in these areas, but we would rather assume more impact than less when considering the impacts to mariners out on the water.
And I read that oftentimes commercial boats are not designed to go much over 10 knots anyway.
Yeah, that's actually a really important point, because just because a vessel may be subject to a speed restriction doesn't mean they're really going to be affected or impacted by it. So, for example, we found in the data that we have for commercial fishing vessels, the vast majority of them already transit at or around 10 knots, regardless of whether those areas have active speed restriction or not. and it's really interesting. We've also seen an interesting trend of vessels, particularly the largest ocean-going vessels. So these are big merchant vessels and cruise ships, transiting at slower speeds, irrespective of any of our speed restrictions. And this may have to do with saving fuel. Fuel is very expensive. It's a major cost for any vessel. And also for the largest vessels, there are requirements for emissions. And the entire east coast of the United States is what's called an emissions control area. And so transiting at slower speeds, again, can help you reduce a vessel's individual emissions.
Okay, we've talked a bit about which kinds of vessels would be impacted. But now let's talk about where and when. And a reminder that the speed reduction zones already exist from the 2008 rule, and these changes would largely extend to the existing areas. There are 2 kinds of zones being proposed. Seasonal.
These seasonal zones are put in place in areas with generally heavier vessel traffic, high levels of risk, persistent whale presence, and extend from Massachusetts all the way down to the northern coast of Florida. And they are primarily active between the months of November and April or May, with one area to the east of Cape Cod remaining through June.
And dynamic zones.
And these zones are triggered outside of active seasonal areas if right whales are detected and there is a greater than 50% likelihood that the whales will remain within this dynamic zone while it's effective. We have certain times of the year when whale presence is more unpredictable, or vessel strike risk can sometimes be a bit lower. And so this allows us some flexibility and nimbleness to address risk where and when it occurs. Also, this allows flexibility for potential changes in right whale distribution, particularly due to climate change.
And what about in cases of emergency, when a mid-sized vessel finds themselves in a speed zone, but something's come up and they have to go above 10 knots? Does the new proposal make accommodations for emergencies?
Definitely. Vessel safety and mariner safety is very important. We are adding a particular provision for emergency. So let's say, someone has broken their leg and a vessel needs to speed in to get someone to the hospital. That is now going to be included under that reasonable need to exceed 10 knots. Additionally, we are adding a special weather provision for vessels under 65 feet because we recognize they have different challenges operating in adverse weather than a large ship would. And so for vessels in the 35 to 65 foot range, if they are transiting within a mandatory speed zone, but in an area where the National Weather Service has declared a gale warning or greater wind warning, like a hurricane warning, they are going to be automatically exempt from any speed regulations so that they can, make sure they get in safely to port.
Lastly, Caroline made a great point about how vessel strikes often occur.
Of the 8 strikes that were reported involving vessels under 65 feet, 7 of those 8 vessels never saw the whale before they struck it.
Captain Ryan, the captain of the boat that I mentioned earlier, knew the area and was actively watching out for debris or obstacles. He was an experienced professional.
The mariners who have reported striking large whales along the East Coast are a wide variety of people. They are recreational boat operators, researchers. In some cases, they were operating with professional observers. These are really responsible boaters who struck these animals.
They're just hard to see. And when you combine increased speed, low visibility, and a predilection for right whale mothers and calves to stay near the water's surface, it can mean disaster for the whales and boaters.
We also anticipate this is going to help other large whales in the Atlantic as well. There are a number of protected and endangered large whale species that occur along the U.S. coast, and they overlap with these areas of high strike risks.
It's for all these reasons that the rule changes have been proposed, and we'd like to hear from you about it. NOAA Fisheries is accepting public comments now through September 30th, 2022, at the Federal Register, federalregister.gov, or you can learn more at our website, fisheries.noaa.gov.
And we very much encourage public comment. There's a lot of work that went into this, and we have a real crisis that we're trying to address. So we're very eager to hear from the public what they think, how they feel this may help right whales, and how they think this may impact vessel community.
Dr. Caroline Good is a large whale ecologist in NOAA Fisheries Office of Protected Resources. I'm John Sheehan, and this has been Dive In with NOAA Fisheries.